Hi, good afternoon. This is Norman or Nutta Feinstein with today's entry to Hasidic Nurses Notes. Today is August 5th and the 22nd day of the Hebrew month of Av or Menachem Av. And we're coming up close to another month or so for Rosh Hashanah, just for our time orientation. Today I'm going to begin with going kind of straight from the Torah text. I did a little bit of that last week with a section regarding Abraham, Abraham Avinu, Abraham, our father, one of the founding fathers of Judaism. Before starting that, let's clarify what is Torah. So Torah has, is a general category, kind of like, not to compare it, but say I'm in Florida now, so you have Miami, this is the city of Miami, then you have Greater Miami. You can have other parallels to that. So Torah essentially is the five books of Moses. I'm not saying it's exactly concerned compared to that. And then the greater Torah, you have the written Torah, or more of the written Torah, like the prophets, the judges, and Psalms, Book of Esther, and so forth. That's like the greater Miami. And that includes the oral Torah and the written Torah. So this is one thing that needs to be clarified, that the written Torah and the oral Torah were both given to Moses out Mount Sinai after they had left Egypt. Now the oral Torah wasn't written, of course, that's why it's all called oral, but it was meant to be handed down by father to son, teacher to student, parallel to that. As we all know, you can have the greatest books in the world, but you still need instructors and teachers to make clear and expound that. So the same way that's a preferred teaching method for the oral Torah, and many of the mitzvahs you'll find in the Torah um, are beyond explanation of how to do it unless you have the oral Torah. For example, we've called classic one is tefillin, or I was going to say the Shabbos, keep the Sabbath holy. And what does that actually mean? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Turns out, as you can tell, that there are many, many mitzvahs, obligations, and prohibitions, and you won't find that in the Torah text. Basically, the main thing is not to start a fire. Other things can be deduced from the text, but not directly. As for everything you'll see that Jew does in keeping the Torah. Now, going forward from that, so why do we have the Talmud now? You hear about the Talmud was written, after the turn of the Common Era. So basically, and grows over the symbolization, that the sages realized that the diaspora was coming up. They already had the Roman occupation, and the difficulty in disseminating Torah improperly. So it was written down so it wouldn't be lost. So it says, well, you didn't have the Talmud was written after the Common Era. It was written down that it was the oral Torah be given before that. So let's not confuse that. So it was all given to Moses at Mount Sinai, the revelation of Hashem after the exodus from Egypt. To go further with that Torah is actually Hashem's wisdom condensed, so to say, um, into a text. Certainly, Hashem's infinite wisdom can't be put in one book or many books. It's infinite, and books are finite. They many many books out with many many details, but they'll still come to areas where you require explanation what's going on. And so, therefore, the Torah is a divine document given through Moses, and therefore Moses didn't come up with it or write it. And if anybody has read through the whole thing, it would be hard to contrive that the Torah was man-made. The complexities and the how would you say there are laws there? You would probably who would ever think of them, uh, especially with spiritual cleanliness and uncleanliness, and some of the holidays like Rosh Hashanah, um, the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and I'm not saying this. It's hard to think that of a people or a group of people were trying to contrive a religion that would make it so complex and complicated and abstract in some areas, and then so beautifully succinct and accurate and prophetic. But again, I just want these are kind of accepted points of what, since we're learning Torah, what is Torah? I'm going to read it from a text. The best I can. It's translated. It was translated actually in this book. The Hebrew is right above the English, and the English wording is like kind of word for word, and therefore the syntax and the grammar and the flow was anything like it was not anything like you'll find in your regular bookstore English Torah or Chumashim. Um, and that brings me to another point that to teach Torah and the teaching of Torah and the learning of Torah, I'm saying I'm only I'm not a amateur, but if a person just reads it from the text, even the best translation, um, you're still missing out tons of information. And there are stories you probably everybody are aware of, they've heard from the Torah, texts that you may not even find it in the Torah, the five books of Moses, the scroll as we see in pictures. Let me get you a picture of that just to clarify for those people who are new to it. The AI depiction, but it kind of better describes it than I could describe it. Okay, I'm going to give a class in this local area, so I had to come up with a advertisement. So that, and by the way, these are parchments made out of animal skins, and have to be done by I'd say, a very legitimate scribe, knowledgeable person. So going on from that is like there are levels of Torah learning. There are four basic levels given with in between, but essentially we have the shot, which is the um, how you say the strict translation, word for word, of best or enough to make a flow of the story. And anybody who's read it, even in English, perhaps an authentic text, will see that there are some things that don't make sense time-wise and in time frame. Some things are left out that when statements are made, we don't know where they came from. So the text, at some levels of learning, actually, they can reconcile that, and that's a very sophisticated level. So going forth, there's another one called the remez, which is hints that I guess say simile metaphors. That this something you read will allude to something. I'll give an example. I'm not sure if this is the official one, but when they left Egypt, it said that they came to an oasis and there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They said this alludes to the 12 tribes and the 70 nations that came out after the Tower of Babel. So this is called remez, and they're hints, things that are learning tools. going forward is the drush, which are explanations. I would say the storylines and some stories which you don't really know how they came to be, but you can see that there is a link, oftentimes a couple of passages or a situation where you need to know where did this come from. Another one is the Sod is the foundation, which is called the Zohar, the mysticism, and that was kept as an extreme secret for thousands of years. Only a certain level of people could learn it. That has been, in some ways, released to the population. But so the point I'm trying to make is when we're talking about Torah learning, just picking up a book off the bookshelf, the bookstore, even the best, you're still missing a lot of information. So I'm going to do the best I can with this part. Um, Basically, I picked the section. It's in the fifth book because it's called Deuteronomy. We call it um, Devorim. There's a lot of repetition of what happened before, but still a lot of new information. So this deals with essentially idol worship and false gods, false prophets, and therefore it's well within the scope of Renaultite to be hearing this. And again, I'm giving you a basic storyline, and don't take this as the ultimate law. And when it comes to putting guilt on yourself or someone, I mean, I guess we have the basic Noahide laws, and 7 laws of Noah, and then the Jews have the 613. Many we're not doing right now because of the absence of the great temple in Jerusalem, and all the mitzvahs are involved with that. Simplification, but nevertheless. So I'm going to start to read some of this and give you some translation and some explanations, and maybe we'll clarify some things for people. And again, it's Torah learning. Okay, so it's it's chapter 13. So it says after we've conquered the nations and the Jewish people come into the land of Canaan, I said Shem said you shouldn't learn their ways, even though they're gone. There's remnants, their temples, their other edifices, their documentation, and we shouldn't try to learn, even if it's you can say, well, it's happened in the world, it's history. Let's find out about it. The exception is that for people who are going to be in the courts to be able to know what idolatry was, worship of false gods. So if there's a case tried, they know really what is involved. What's such a thing, and did a person worship a false god? So going forward, we'll try to sift through this because it's a little extensive. So don't do don't do what they did like with their gods as an abomination, which Hashem hates, and even says even their sons and their daughters they would put through fire or burn. And not only that, other family members as a mode of the idol worship. Um, it's kind of incidental, or that people now sacrifice their children, explosives and fire and the like. And not necessarily for an idol, but you have to question what kind of motive, what kind of source of information is that. And when we come to that, then what is the mode of worship of an idol? Now, some idols have their own specific way of worshiping them. One is translated the idol Mercury, Mercurus, and it was to throw stones at it, which actually seemed to be quite a sign of disrespect. Another idol had it called Baal had even a worse way of worshiping that no anybody with the right mind would think that this is hardly be called a way of worship. So when you have an idol, the person was accused of worshiping an idol, you have to find out what the worship for that idol was. So if someone threw stones at the other idol I mentioned, they didn't worship it. And if they threw stones at Mercury, they did. So your first categorization of how to serve an idol is that you have to find out, and we don't have to find it out. Maybe there's a jury against, really get involved with what the idol worship was. And but if we do know, we avoid it. Now, there's another category of idol worship, which is not specific to any idol. There are four categories or fundamental categories that if anybody does them to an idol or false god, then they're guilty of the idol worship. Now, I'll mention what they are. One is to offer an animal sacrifice. Another is to burn incense. Another is to pour wine, a wine libation. And another one is to bow down before the idol. Now, what if that idol I mentioned, the Mercurus, didn't have any of those four? Then the person's still guilty. And where's it come from? Because these were the fundamental forms of worship of God in the great temple in Jerusalem. So this was the universal mode of worship. So if any of those were done, it belonged to an idol, even though it wasn't related to the idol, then they were guilty of idol worship. Now, in case we get into punishments for idol worship, another interesting fact, excuse me, I mentioned before is with Noahide and other commandments that are in Judaism, is that without the great temple and the great Sanhedrin, which was the great high court, which was found in the temple, that there are no executions or some of the other um, punishments for deeds as there were at that time that the temple existed. And therefore, if someone happens to make a mistake, it shouldn't happen, but to know that, for example, there's no official designation or certificate of membership for Noahide, as it was mentioned in the Torah, what it really is. Like you have, of course, a Noahide group you want to call it, there's not a problem, and of course follow the ways. So great, but not get involved so much to think that if you made a mistake or you're afraid to get involved because you might be making a mistake and who knows what the punishment will be. It's like, do the best you can and go forward. Oversimplification, but I want to make that point. Guilt is not the primary motivator in most learning sessions and not applicable in many ways even now. Although doing the wrong thing is the wrong thing, but the consequences are different. Going forward, it says that we shouldn't add or subtract from the Torah. So Torah law, so what is really coming to be if you have a person who calls himself a prophet, and whatever level you want to call that, or calls themselves, that there are signs that um, indicate the validity of this person. And miracles is not necessarily the you call the final marker of a prophet. Even today, probably unknown to many, but miracles are still happening, and there's people who are doing them, not as their main thrust of um, their, their worship or the service of God in the nation and the people of the world. But if you tell some people, well, I got somebody that does miracles, as well and good, but that's just the beginning of the validation process. And one of the ways of validating it is that a person who declares to be a prophet and he has powers and he can foresee the future and what he says is valid. I mean, he's getting into the ballpark. But if he tells you that he is given permission to invalidate the laws given by Moses, received from the God out on Sinai, then this is a refutation of his status of being a prophet. So within the framework of the seven mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, children of Noach, and the mitzvahs of the Jews and the Torah, a prophet has to work within that. So he can't invalidate, remove, add to, or diminish any of that. And as, as a prophet. Now you will see that sort of an editorial that some things are not done like they were in the old days, and maybe it's not totally dependent on the temple, maybe other factors involved. So we have rabbinical courts, and even in this era, and greats knowledgeable in the Torah, the Talmud, Jewish law, and they will get together and see, for example, where does electricity fall in the category of Sabbath observance? So sometimes technology occurs, and you have to find out how it fits, or is it a problem to use it or not? So I said to be careful. I'm going to go to an area now, and again, the same book, Deuteronomy, the fifth book, a little earlier, and it deals with validating um, the presentation of the Torah as we do as the Jews, and that the text will reveal that Hashem and Moses are speaking to the Jewish people, Hashem especially, saying, remember how I revealed myself to you at Mount Sinai, and initially, verbally, not visually, but verbally, they heard the words of God coming from the mountain, coming from the clouds and the fire. And the tradition is, and the text confirms it, that the first two commandments, the, the nation, the Jewish nation, which included at that time what's called the Arab Rav, the great mixed multitude, which were people who were Egyptians or who were in Egypt, who thought this was an opportune time to join the Jewish nation, with all the miracles and the evidence of God's omnipotence and relationship with the Jewish people. So they came along, converted. So that revelation at Mount Sinai was in front of just counting um, men between the ages of 20 to 60 was like 600,000, around 600,000. So you could extrapolate that data, and with the older people, the women, and the other children under 20, it's easily 2 million. So you had a revelation of God in front of over 2 million people. And they heard it and they saw the visions that were occurring. Of course, they didn't see God, but it's even with that, they said the revelation of God was so much that their souls couldn't take it. And that's when they came to Moses and said, Moses, you received the rest of this. So Moses went up in the mountain in the midst of the fire and smoke, and God spoke to him. Now, this is in the text. So if anybody's giving you a hard time about the validity of what happened, and how you're refuting you are refuting the text, and I'm not looking at the translations of anybody other groups, but I think most of it confirms that. And there's really no refutation of that occurring in those eras. The children, parents, the grandchildren, grandparents. You don't find a document refutation that never happens. Just later in the thousands and millennia, people start refuting it. But again, and if you refute one area of the Torah, and then you're refuting all of it. And a lot of religions are based on what's in the Torah. So we have a valid statement from God saying to the Jewish people, "I revealed myself to you and to Moses, and like say millions of people." And this is the unique experience, a whole nation, not just one individual claiming that they had a revelation, but the whole nation saw the revelation first for themselves initially, and then with Moses. So, okay, I'm an amateur with making videos. I'm not sure where I left off. I started talking and then I didn't realize I didn't have it on. But I'm going to switch into an area related in part to what we were speaking about before, is validation of God. I would say classically, the discussions between theology and science, creationism and evolution. And I was associated with a person I'm very close with who had made it a point to refute Judaism as a religion and the existence of God. And usually I find that people who do that have their own needs for that externally to what they're presenting. But nevertheless, they were well read, did a lot of research, and I spoke to a lot of people who had their point of view. And I have a conversation with a rabbi, uh, and the rabbi kind of was stumped what to answer. And how you say sometimes I don't know answer intellectually, but feeling wise, it doesn't refute my feelings. I think I've heard enough information from other sources to put the whole thing together, but I had the good fortune of being in an area where there was a Jewish person, who was, and at that time, a university professor in the sciences. very sophisticated sciences, and he himself did a lot of work on this area in science and theology. And he was also a very learned Jew. He was authority in many areas where even rabbis went to him, even though he was a Balshevi in his later in his I guess in his 20s or around that area. He switched and went to a religious path, and the learning went with it. And I said to myself, this is a person that this atheist should have spoken to, because I heard the presentations of this rabbi who had been on both sides of or was on both sides of the field, and he just seemed to have an answer for all these scientific refutations. And I was thinking, well, I should somehow have to hook him up. But then I realized that sooner or later, we have the situation where intellect will take a person so far. And then finally, you have to have that area of, we'll say, faith. Go. Now, we learn in Hasidic doctrine, not to say others don't, but make a point to say that the more you learn, um, you have to know God, which is a mitzvah actually, the less you're dependent on the faith. But that only comes up to a certain point, because to say you can learn everything about God enough to answer all the questions, that is a problematic, because God's infinite, and God is to create the world. It has to be beyond what a man can recognize. So therefore, even if I put a person together with this doctor rabbi, and eventually it's probably going to still come to that area of blind faith. Now, this is not a blind faith that people who instinctively have, people who have very little religious backgrounds at all, but when they're challenged to deny their faith, they won't, to the extremes. But I'm talking, and these people are noteworthy and need to be complimented, impressive. But I have talking about a person now who really, Tacitus puts a lot of emphasis on knowing who and what is God. How does he create the world, and how do we function within the creation, and how do we function with God? But again, sooner or later, there's going to come a place where there's faith. And I saw a writing by the Rebbe where he himself presented many, many examples of how a person could deduce there had to be God. How the Jewish people existed for so many thousand years without a land, with extreme hardship, and many other phenomena that don't make sense logically. He, and he gave many examples, but it finally came to the point where he said that you're not going to be able to use this the absolute proof that there is a God and he creates the world. But sooner or later, uh, we have to rely on faith, and this is part of God's plan, because with that, it gives us free choice. If we have total revelation of God in front of us, then we don't have the choice to go against God's will. So we still have an area of doubt, with all the other proofs that lead to belief in God. It should perhaps be enough to take that step. But the Rebbe says that people still need have to rely on faith, and that gives them the opportunity to have free choice whether they want to or do not want to follow God. And the rewards that come from following God should come to them. So I thought that was a pretty good answer. And even if the Rebbe, especially the Rebbe said it, but I read in another one of the volumes of Hasidic rabbis, and they took it another step. I won't say another step further, but they added another step. And it said that no matter how much reading you do, how much information you acquire, that and how many answers it gives you, it's not going to be enough. There is another step that has to be taken to maximize, we'll say, our intellectual capacity, potential, and that is to dwell on the subject. We use the word hisbonenus, to contemplate, if you want, or meditate. But if anybody's, I've used the example, having a very important encounter in the next day. This could be for work, could be a sporting event, it could be who knows. Um, Court appearance doesn't have to be criminal, could be business. But the person thinks about all the details. And as you think about the details, avenues open. You don't need drugs necessarily to expand the mind. You just need to use the mind and work on the mind and take the time and thinking about uh, things that are not so vital. So it took this point and said we have to make this emphasis on contemplating what we already know. And it says if a person thinks about things that are in front of his nose that and really probes it, that is going to come to almost without question, there's no doubt. You're not going to have revelations of God, but the doubt is going to be minimized. I'm going to take the chance of using science, which I don't like because usually you find some exception to that rule. But, again, growing of plants from a seed. You have a small seed, and in time you have a massive tree. And what do we have? The dirt, even very good soil, but how do you produce a tree which you can burn, fire, or use for wood from dirt? And I don't think they've come up with the answer to photosynthesis yet. But taking it even closer to home is time. We in Judaism believe that time is a creation. So you have to, think about it. When did time begin? When will time end? It staggers the imagination, but it's not illogical. The Alter Rebbe in this presentation also said, what about place? Where does the space begin? Where does the space end? Once you have an end, then there's a border. So what goes on beyond the border. And finally, I'm going to say finally, but the last one that I saw is cause and effect. And see this, it teaches that in worldly matters we have cause and effect. You light a match or you strike a piece of flint and you get sparks. And usually, say with people, a child eventually realizes that he can from a parent, and parent knows a child, cause and effect. But with the creation of the world, what's the cause? Can we recognize the cause? Again, staggers imagination, but I don't think it's beyond logic. So the more we learn about God, the more we learn in general how to use our intellect, and the more proper sources that we come to, that gap between belief and knowledge decreases, but we still don't lose the need to believe. I wish you a good week. Thank you for participation. I know it's a little long.